good evening or good day or good afternoon, everyone, depending on the continent you happen to be on. Yeah, I'm Tommi Kokkonen from the Department of Physics, the University of Helsinki, Finland. I'm presenting together with Lennart Schalk, actually our recently published paper, One Instructional Sequence Fits All, a conceptual analysis of the applicability of the concreteness fading. So it was published in the Educational Psychology Review. Also be sharing some slides from our recent study that's under review as well. So yeah, without further ado, let's start with the little personal history, if you will, like a prequel to our analysis, because one of the authors of this paper is a cognitive psychologist who investigates science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education, and the other is a physics education specialist. And the physicist in question told the psychologist that, yeah, students in physics always struggle in understanding certain topics, and the psychologist came up with this idea of, or suggested using this so-called concreteness fading sequence in teaching them, and together they tried to kind of come up with this interventional materials or learning materials, but ran into trouble and wondered why, and thought to mathematics, chemistry, biology, education experts working in higher education. And while initially everyone liked the idea of concreteness fading, all ran into some trouble when trying to design intervention materials to teach to implement the concept of, or the idea of, concreteness fading for higher education. So with this kind of background experience, we started digging into this concreteness fading idea. And just a brief outline. First, go through the basic idea of concreteness fading, and then present our small experimental study, and then go through the central ideas of our paper, which was published in the Educational Psychology Review, and end up with some take-home messages. So first, what is concreteness fading? A bit of background. Usually learning these rather abstract or difficult concepts in STEM fields entails that you combine these multiple external representations. So for instance, pie charts for learning fractions or equations in physics, together with these all kinds of other visualizations, for instance. And these different representations have different advantages and disadvantages for learning. And then you use different combinations to support learning. Well, much is known, but much is still unknown, actually, how these different external representations influence learning, at least learning of the more advanced concepts in science. And one particular issue is the sequence in which these multiple representations should be presented. And one suggestion towards this is the so-called concreteness fading sequence. And to put it briefly, concreteness fading utilizes or tries to utilize these different virtues that the different representations might have, and is actually put forward a somewhat widely applicable instructional or this general instructional approach to sequence these multiple representations. And the basic idea with concreteness fading is that students should start with concrete representations and always gradually then progress towards using idealized representations. So for instance, with pictures or with apples first, and then pictures of apples, and then before they are introduced to the Arabic numerals, for instance. We give more examples later. And of course, there are these links on to some conceptions or ideas of Jerome Bruner from the 60s, and this kind of concrete representational abstract sequence developed in mathematics education. These share the same basic idea of these three representations that are presented in this order. And the concreteness fading is suggested to benefit learning by first introducing this target concept, for instance, equivalence in mathematics in a grounded and familiar context. So here we have this balance scale, and then gradually fade towards the idealized representation, which then introduces students to the kind of general or nature of the target concept. Of course, some have argued, perhaps most famously, the Kaminsky, Slutsky, and Heckler paper published in Science, that students should start with idealized representation. So start from the kind of the symbolic representations, for instance, because this would then reduce the amount of irrelevant detail and thereby facilitate transfer from the beginning. So, and they would only later be introduced to these very rich, concrete representations. And there is actually encouraging evidence for concreteness fading from different studies in mathematics, but they are mostly been studied with rather simple concepts and with kind of these two-step sequences, whereas concreteness fading typically argue for this three-step sequence. So from this, we actually wanted to try out this in a more advanced setting and in physics. I'm gonna just briefly share our study, which is now under review. We had like high school students learning the concepts of magnetic flux and Faraday's law in physics. So, and to put it very simply, magnetic flux is kind of the amount of magnetic field going through some surface, like a conducting loop or whatever. And Faraday's law states that if this magnetic flux through a coil or a conducting loop changes, it induces a voltage in the coil, and the voltage is proportional to the rate of change of the flux. So this is a very, very complex idea actually, and students do have problems with this, learning this, specifically that they think that the induced voltage is directly proportional to the flux and not to the rate of change. So there is this quite difficult relational reasoning that students have to grasp. And actually that they don't have very much experience with prior experience or knowledge from this kind of phenomena as compared to mechanics, for instance, where they have pushed or lifted heavy stuff or seen stuff move. So we actually thought that for these reasons would be a nice topic to test the concreteness fading approach. And we had two conditions: concreteness fading and concreteness introduction. In the concreteness fading condition, they first learned with these tasks where they had to actually do this experiment with actual magnets and coils and stuff and see whether there was voltage induced. Then they did tasks with this intermediate representation where you had field lines, these arrows representing the magnetic field, and the coil represented as this black circle here. And finally, with sort of idealized representation where the magnetic flux or the amount of magnetic field is represented in this graph with respect to time. So the change can be seen here. So in concreteness fading, they started with the concrete experiments, and in concreteness introduction, they started with the idealized tasks and progressed towards the concrete tasks. We had a simple pretest for assessing their knowledge in, well, about graphs, but also about magnetism, basic concepts, and devised a post-test where we then assessed or had tasks in each of these representations. So with the concrete representations, intermediate, so field line representations, the idealized task with the graphs, and actually combinations of these three. So kind of balanced assessment of all these representations. And we ran an ANCOVA. Actually, using the pretest as a covariate, did not find any differences between these conditions, contrary to our expectations, perhaps. And actually, we also did a kind of exploratory analysis of the self-explanations, which we prompted during the learning tasks. And because concreteness fading kind of has this idea that you kind of learn first with these concrete representations and then kind of carry over this knowledge that you gain across these different representations. So we tried to analyze that, but saw no evidence of that basically. And anyway, no differences across the different conditions. Yeah, this also prompted our interest in analyzing the concreteness fading sequence further across these different domains. But now Lennart can probably continue from here.
Yeah, I'll now shortly explain how we conducted our conceptual analysis by saying something very quickly about external representations, about learning with multiple external representations, and the reason why we are here in this seminar series about analogical reasoning that may be involved in these learning processes. And then I'll hand back over to Tommi, who will precisely analyze the physics content again, and maybe if we have time, say something about chemistry and biology as well. So Tommi, can you? Yes, thank you. As we said, we approached this idea of concreteness fading from a rather applied perspective, so that we talked to a lot of science educators, how would you implement that and so on. And when you talk to real educators, they always highlight a specific idea that has been most clearly described by Biggs, I would say, and that is termed constructive alignment. That means like the curriculum or unit objectives are clearly stated in terms of content-specific levels of understanding that apply appropriate performances. The teaching methods require students to be placed in contexts that will likely elicit those performances, and the assessment tasks address those same performances. Basically, that means you specify learning goals, devise an instructional setting accordingly, and then have as an assessment, might be a formative or a summative assessment, that actually is telling about the setting and the learning goals that you had. It's a basic idea, but it's a quite strong idea, and it's often violated by instructors actually. So they have problems in devising assessment tasks, for example, because they violated. So as I said, our analysis requires to specify certain aspects, and I guess most of you might be highly familiar with these ideas, so I'll be quick on them. With external representations, we now will always talk about external and internal representations, and because they are distinct, right? As you may know, external representations are distinct from internal representations, such as concepts, mental models, or schemata. Internal representations reside in the individual, whereas external representations are entities or objects in the world. Right? So the internal representation is a body of knowledge about a specific thing outside. Oh, now the presentation stopped. Tommy, can you share it again?
Yeah, sorry, I had my.
Otherwise,
yeah, sorry.
All right, and you can directly jump to the next one.
Yeah.
So as I guess you might all be familiar with these. Then, of course, you can try to describe and categorize external representations. There are many approaches to doing that. One which is, of course, the basic idea for concreteness fading is to align them from concrete to abstract, or from concrete to idealized. Or in a paper which I once wrote with Dan Belenki, we called it more idealized or more grounded. We use this pizza graph here, in which you can see that you can either teach about fractions with a real pizza, or with more idealized versions of pizzas, or introduce symbolic representations. You can also introduce irrelevant features like pepperoni slices on the pizza and so on. Whatever, that's just an idea that you can sort and specify external representations. And actually, when we got into analyzing concreteness fading within different domains, we were lucky that some other people, Lin Sun and Rutt II, already came up with an idea of how to align concreteness fading and multiple level of concreteness across different disciplines. And that's what you see in this table here. On the left-hand side are the typical example from mathematics, in which you start with concrete examples, like with this balance scale, and then move to more faded examples. And in the end, you have the symbolic notation, which is the typical learning goal in mathematics. Understanding the symbolic notation and being able to do procedures with these symbolic notations. In physics, chemistry, and biology, that's a bit different, right? In physics, for example, you often have macro scale phenomena that are the ones that you can directly perceive. As Tommy said, you could, for example, play around with magnets and coils and so on, which is a macro scale model. In the next model, you would see a representation of the forces which are in there, so the magnetic field, for example. And then you might also learn about some symbolic representation, which of course share a lot of similarity with mathematics, because they use the language of mathematics, right? And you see it here for the other disciplines as well. So I think we can go to the next slide. Thank you, Tommy. And a second important point when we talk about external representation, and that's actually the more important point for our conceptual analysis, is that external representations are selective. That is, they are purposefully constructed to highlight specific aspects of a situation, a principle, or a theory, such as isolating some causal factors from others, as it's typically the case in scientific modeling. And because of the selectiveness, when you go into real classrooms, you see representations rarely used in isolation. Right? So it's a very basic idea to strictly separate representations. So look on a page in your textbooks, whatever topic, you will see many different kinds of representations with different concreteness, probably. And of course, we are also not the first to think about external representations. A very famous framework is about using multiple external representations. So a famous framework is this framework by Ainsworth, and she described the various functions that combining external representations may have. So you may combine them because they have complementary roles, or because one representation constrains the interpretation of another representation, or that they help to construct a deeper understanding, maybe by schema abstraction processes or so on. And then you can even go into more details and specify them even more. But even already from this slide, you see that it's probably not that easy to just have a simple idea. Well, going from concrete to idealized is always the best thing, right? It may depend on the functions that you have. And now, with regard to analogical reasoning, and that's just the framework that we used for our conceptual analysis, we used the structural alignment theory put forward by Dietrich Gentner, and thought a little bit about which learning processes do you typically want to trigger in a domain by presenting several external representations of these four learning mechanisms that Gentner specified. So is it more about schema abstraction? Is it more about difference detection? Is it about inference projection? Is it about representation, or several of them combined? So, and then to give you an example, again, jump back to mathematics. You have already seen this schematic representation by Fyfe and Nathan about how you could think about concreteness fading to concrete real apples, to pictures of apples, and there's a symbolic representation, or this example for learning about the mathematical concept of equivalence. And we also put here another example that are actually the materials that were also used by Kaminsky, Slutsky, and Heckler, and McNeil and Fyfe used them again with undergraduates, as far as I remember, which is about a very specific math concept. And they seem to indicate that if you use more abstract representation, as you called them, you should provide them later, and concreteness fading is very helpful. So maybe to show you the results of two of these examples, when this study about equivalence was conducted with second and third graders, and actually they had four different conditions. That's typical in many concreteness fading studies, that they also look into how do the students learn with only one representation at hand, so only with the concrete or only with the idealized. But both of these studies, also the one with undergraduates, found in the math domain that concreteness fading led to the best transfer performance. And now we can quickly do our conceptual analysis for mathematics. And in the paper, we looked at three parts, actually. So it's the relation of the external representations to each other. It's the typical learning goal that you pursue in a domain. And it's about the processes that you may want to trigger. And of course, with regard to the processes, these are gradual differences. Of course, they all go on at the same time, but some might be more important, and you may provide some scaffolding to trigger some of them more. So we believe that in mathematics, the external representations are typically isomorphic. So you really can align them on one dimension from concrete to abstract. They just strip away detail. So they become more and more idealized. The concrete representations are typically arbitrary. It doesn't matter whether you learn the symbolic Arabic numerals with apples, bananas, oranges, cars, or whatever. So it's arbitrary. And the typical learning goal in mathematics is understanding the mathematical formalism, as I said before. And so we believe that concreteness fading in mathematics is basically about inference projection from the initial representation, the concrete representation, to the next representation, to the next representation, with the overall goal to have a abstracted schema, which is typically the mathematical formalism which is used, which might provide you with some glasses with which you can look at the world and only see mathematical numbers there. So I give back to Tommi, and he will tell you something about physics.
Yeah, if we jump back to physics, I will quickly then go into detail where we think that what things might be different for physics than for mathematics. And there are some examples, of course, I already presented you with our study. Also, there are other examples of concreteness fading studies using different representations. And actually, we also had this kind of hypothetical, but actually quite common example what you could see in the physics textbooks that we had in our article. And regarding some other studies from concreteness fading, actually also from Finland, Tommi Kokkonen and Cohen-Vermans used this concrete, or what they called concrete and idealized simulations to teach DC circuit concepts to 4th, 5th, and 6th graders. So their concrete simulations had these kind of bulbs that were glowing in different brightnesses, and their idealized simulation actually then had resistors in place of the bulbs. And they compared learning only with the concrete simulation to learning with concreteness fading. So first concrete and then idealized. And they actually did not find advantages, at least for concreteness fading, even as for some of their experiments there was advantage for learning only with concrete representations, regardless of whether the transfer tasks were presented in concrete or idealized representations. But then they themselves then speculated that, yeah, well, maybe defining concrete and idealized may be more difficult in practice than in theory. I mean, even with their representations, you can discuss whether the other is actually more concrete than the other. They're just, you know, bulbs versus resistors or whatnot. But then also, if you look at our representations or this concreteness fading sequence, it's not that kind of straightforwardly aligned from concrete to idealized. So it's not about, you know, shedding irrelevant features as in mathematics, but you actually introduce some relevant stuff. For instance, these field lines, which aren't, you know, visible, at least in the concrete setting, or you get this representation of time on the x-axis here. So you always have this complementarity in these different representations in physics, for instance. And then from this, it kind of follows that we don't have this kind of strict analogy between these representations. And this is actually debated in philosophy of science, that whether scientific models are isomorphic with the targets or whatever. So it's actually a debate there, but yeah, we can say probably that these are not analogous or isomorphic, at least not in any kind of strict sense. And actually, what's known from physics is that then inferring this, or inferring any, you know, abstract law from this concrete representations is very difficult. So puts kind of in question whether progressing from concrete to idealized would work in a similar way as it does in mathematics. And of course, that where in mathematics you had kind of the learning goal was to learn the idealized representation. In physics, all of these are of importance. You should actually learn all of these. You should learn this concrete setting. You should learn this intermediate representation and the idealized representation, and how they, you know, fit to each other. So it's not just introducing this idealized idea in the concrete setting, it's also about learning these concrete representations. And then to somehow speculate about the learning processes here, of course, you also have these mapping processes, which might be helpful, for instance, in the case of the different DC circuit simulations. They were quite close in at least in perceptual terms. You might have there's some evidence from that comparing them, or comparing real and simulated circuits, supports understanding, and also that that such, of course, comparison would support abstraction, because they both real and simulated circuits would then be governed by similar rules. And of course, then there might be these re-representation processes going on with when you have visual representations of magnetic fields, would then enhance or enrich your mental representations about magnetic field, because it kind of includes information about the direction, or you might get this enriched representation through thinking it as in terms of these vector representations of these arrows. And of course, inference projection, we can probably, with the aid of these field line representations, then infer something about the concrete, and hopefully infer something about concrete representations. So, and I guess it's, when it comes to all these processes, it's the matter of how to best support them, and whether they are actually best supported with this concreteness fading sequence. And to show a kind of overview of our analysis, of course, we have this a bit different learning goal than we have in mathematics, that all the three representations in physics are of importance, and they have to be also understood individually, and that the physics representations don't necessarily align that closely. At least these examples that we gave don't align that closely to each other as they might do in mathematics. And the more, yep.
Sorry to interrupt, Tommy. Just to let you know, there's about 10 minutes left till we swap over.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks. We'll can leave some time for questions. Yeah. So yeah, and one point that the more abstract representations may also add information, not just shed irrelevant detail. And that actually the learning processes that you would want to trigger are also quite complex, depending perhaps from the representations that we use there. I will now have quite short in time. In the paper we had these examples from biology as well, and from chemistry, and the studies that there have been. For instance, so Rob Goldstone attending, he had this nice paper about biology, concreteness fading in biology, but you can, I will shamelessly now advertise our paper, that if you want to read more about our analysis concerning that, you can probably go and download the paper. But yeah, just to give some discussion or conclusions, the concreteness fading in the literature, at least, is put forward as this very widely applicable instructional approach. There's, of course, mixed evidence from other topics than mathematics, and our conceptual analysis, hopefully, we have managed to convince you that there are these quite fundamental differences between representations in like, for instance, in physics, and they differ from those in mathematics. So that might kind of explain the mixed evidence, and also that the learning goals and the learning mechanisms that we would like to trigger differ between these domains, and we suppose that all these differences between the domains might impact the effectiveness of the different sequencing of representations. And to put it boldly, a concreteness fading approach might not be the omnipotent approach as which it sometimes advocated. So with this bold statement, I would like to conclude our presentation and maybe give time for some questions.